All right. We are so excited that you all are here. So definitely want to welcome you yet again to Change Consulting's Digital Security for Social Justice Organizations webinar. It is a much needed conversation, and I think you are going to love what you hear from our two speakers today. We appreciate your time. We thank you for joining us for this conversation, and we hope that you continue to join us because this is a monthly series that we are doing. And like I mentioned, for the month of April, we are discussing digital security. And we have a special guest who's going to be joining our CEO, Bilen, to have a conversation, but I'll talk about that in a few minutes. I would love for you all to get to know more about Change Consulting. Change Consulting is an award-winning impact communications partner for racial and social justice leaders. We help movement leaders, nonprofits, funders turn their ideas, their programs or initiatives into strategy, creative, and activation that shifts the hearts, minds, and policy. We act, we plan, and we train. What we like to say is we get it and we get it done. And so if you are interested in just learning more about who we are and learning more about what we do, please make sure you head over to our website. That link will be dropped in the chat for you so that you can take a look at our website and get to know us. And while you're there, go ahead and sign up for our email list. And also make sure you drop us a message because we would love to talk to you to get to know if you have any communications needs. And if you do have needs, we would love to help you sort of figure that out. So yes, drop us a note. We would love to have a conversation with you, schedule some time with us. So please make sure you head over to our website, and that link was just dropped in the chat. Like I said, we get it. And we like to get it done for you, of course. Introducing who will be joining us today, none other than our very own Bilen Mesfin Packwood. She is the CEO of Change Consulting. And also joining her today is going to be Amro, who is the founder and CEO of Shake Technologies. And I would like to now let Bilen step in, and she is going to come forth and tell you a little bit more about our speaker today. And then we will allow the conversation to go forth. So I'll turn it over to you, Bilen.
Thank you, Larisha. Appreciate you for that awesome introduction. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today as well. I see some colleagues and some friends, some clients on this call. So thank y'all for making time to join us today. I know so many of you all are holding a lot. You're running campaigns. You're responding to attacks on our communities. You're trying to keep teams resourced and whole. So I appreciate you carving out time for this really important conversation on digital security. So in Change's work with racial justice and social justice organizations, we do quite a bit of work around rapid response, crisis communications, and what it takes to show up in public when our communities are under threat. And we help organizations prepare crisis communications plans, talking points, and much more when they're in the middle of grappling with a crisis scenario. And one thing that's really clear to us is that you can't talk about crisis communications without also talking about digital security. When our movements are visible, they're also vulnerable. So the same tools that we rely on to organize, to tell our stories, email, social media, messaging apps, shared drives, are the same tools that can be used to target us, whether that's through a targeted disinfo and misinfo attack, through doxing, harassment, hacking, etc. And so in a crisis moment when we're moving fast, those vulnerabilities can really make the difference between being able to respond clearly and safely, being forced offline right when our community needs us the most. So that's really why we're here today, because we want to treat digital security not as an IT problem, a technical add-on, but really as core crisis comms and rapid response infrastructure for racial and social justice work. One thing I want to say too, because I'm on the same journey with you all, is that we're not here to really make anyone feel left behind or ashamed about whether or not we have all our ducks in a row when it comes to our digital security. We know when it comes to comms or tech, most of our organizations are not resourced or trained for this. So our goal really is to try to meet you where you are, offer some practical steps, and help you connect the dots between the digital choices we're making every day and our ability to communicate clearly and sustain our work for the long haul. With that, I also want to say that I am not a digital security expert. I'm a comms expert, but I have a lot to learn when it comes to digital security. And so that's why I'm really excited to be joined by my friend Amro Radwan from Shake Technologies. Amro is the founder of Shake. It's a mission-driven IT and digital security consulting firm established in 2008. They have a very clear purpose of empowering nonprofit organizations, progressive institutions, and social justice movement groups through technology. They specialize in digital security, general technology consulting, staff trainings, etc. Amro and his team have been really pivotal in helping thousands of organizations leverage technology. I will say that we share a lot of the same clients. If there's anyone who ever needs digital security help, I am always referring them to Amro. And then, when we needed help shoring up our digital security, there was a moment where we were working on a really high profile political campaign, and we knew we needed to get our digital house in order. Amro and his team were the ones we called to help us with some staff trainings, to help us monitor anything that was happening in the deep web, if any mention around our name or our work, so that we can be alerted about any risks to our reputation. And I will just transparently also say we're in the process of actually implementing the plan that they have given us so we can be ready. But it helped us be really protected and feel safe taking on this really high profile campaign where we know that there were some opponents working against us. I think it helped us really minimize risk in that way. So we also did a 2-part written Q&A with Amro that's on our blog right now. Larisha will share in the chat. But thank you, Amro, for joining us today for this conversation. I'm really excited for you to be able to share some of your wisdom and hard-fought knowledge that you've gained in this work with everyone here today. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Bilen. So happy to be here and happy to go through these questions. But I do just want to acknowledge that we've known each other for quite some time now,
By some time, yes.
and I think there really is something there about just the relationship and trust, and it really is deeply rooted in the work that we do, not just with you and your organization, but with the other organizations that we also support and work with. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was going to say we've known each other more than a decade. I feel like both of our organizations have kind of grown in parallel tracks
Yeah.
together, from solo consultants to now like with teams and working with lots of organizations. And I really mean it when I say we share so many of the same clients too. So I'm really excited to talk with you. I want to start with just some background and grounding. So maybe share a little bit about just what got you into digital security and specifically to working with social justice organizations and community-based groups.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would love to start with just even going way back.
Yeah.
I'm the son of Egyptian immigrants who came to the U.S. Frankly, after my father was imprisoned
Mm,
in the 60s during the crackdown on student movement. So I was
mm,
really born into this idea around social justice. Personally, I was born in Paterson, New Jersey, grew up in Philly, New York, and now in California. But when I was in Philly, one of my earliest political sort of memories was my father taking us around the ruins of the Move bombing in Philadelphia in 1985. If folks don't know about that, you can sort of Google that. But this was the time when, at that time, the mayor actually dropped a bomb on a city block in Philadelphia. And this was, this is in the 80s, post the civil rights movement. But this is also when things were really crazy at that time. But for me, it was like my first lesson that I remember in terms of understanding state power and
mm,
violence.
mm.
And that memory still, I mean, in many ways has transformed who I am, but has also has stayed with me, right? I'll also say also in the 80s, we used to shop at garage sales, and I got my first computer. It was a something called the TRS-80, which I hope folks
Wow.
can also Google. And but that machine really sparked my like lifelong commitment, and sort of curiosity around technology and problem solving. Having a computer from a garage sale by default meant there was a lot of problems with it, and you know, I was the one that was trying to figure out how to make that thing work.
Wow.
I'll sort of fast forward to like the 2000s. I really in the 2000s it was sort of like post 9/11 and the Patriot Act era. And it was impossible to ignore how like surveillance policy was being used against communities like mine, right?
Mm.
And that pushed my focus, pushed my work and focus around my work around the intersection of technology and justice. I spent time at the time at an organization called the Community Technology Foundation of California, supporting organizations and helping them like build their tech infrastructure. And so this is, really during that time in the early 2000s. Another sort of interesting piece was I helped found a group of folks, and we called it Techies of Color. And this again was also in the early 2000s, where I
Wow.
connected with other folks, people of color here in the Bay Area, to create more inclusive spaces for folks who were in tech, but were usually like the only person of color in their spaces. Shake Technologies and my company now, we were founded in 2008, and it really was that nonprofits and movement organizations were being served either by like corporate IT,
Mhm.
and a lot of that corporate IT was really built around like revenue protection, as opposed to like what does the organization need, what are they doing, and so very intentionally, at Shake Technologies, we operate at the intersection of social justice and technology. So we're very intentional about that. So, my company, we specialize in providing cybersecurity and tech consulting, and we only work with nonprofits, and the vast majority of them are social justice organizations. So, after 2 decades into like tech in general, I've been able to build again like deep relational partnerships across different types of organizations, whether that's racial justice orgs, immigrant rights,
Mhm.
progressive philanthropy, and this idea around working with movement-based organizations and supporting their infrastructure, but also protecting their infrastructure as well.
Mm.
So, it really has been embedded in transactional. Yeah.
I love that. And I actually had not heard that story. So,
Thank
uh,
you.
also a reminder, the lack sometimes breeds the most resourcefulness too. So I love that story about the computer
Yeah.
that you got from a garage sale, getting you on this journey.
I'm
Um,
getting there now.
yeah, for sure. And I'm also struck by just how much I think the tech landscape has changed so much. The big tech landscape has changed so much even since you started in 2008, right? And so I'm curious, like, how you define digital security now. And then a follow-up question to that is, when you look at the current landscape, what are kind of the top two or three threats facing our movements right now?
Well, so you said a bunch of things in that, but I want to first address like the idea around big tech and just tech in general. So tech, of course, is always evolving.
Mhm.
From a very technical standpoint, it's been one of the toughest things is just the fact that stuff is always evolving purely from
Yeah.
a technical standpoint. Um, I tell people that's how I've lost my hair. It's just like I keep up with the latest tech. Um, but I also feel like there's this giant risk around big tech and how much power they have over us, right?
Mhm.
And I don't want to go too far into a tangent, but I'll just
Yeah.
say that like, I'm here talking to you over a Zoom using my MacBook. And if you see Tim Cook, who was hanging out at the White House in September, giving him it just
Yeah.
there's just so much there's so much controversy in my opinion around the role of big tech and how close they've gotten to to
State power.
yeah, to state power and just like really bad things that happen.
Mm-hmm.
But here we are forced to use some of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a big advocate of saying, well, let's just go back to papers
Yeah.
and pencils, although that would be liberating.
Yeah.
I think, using these tools in a way that helps us become effective and efficient, but using them in a way that's a little bit smarter and more secure is really core into what we do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in terms of like digital security, really at its core, it really is about three things for us. It's like, keeping your information confidential, and can you trust that it hasn't been tampered with, and can you actually access it when you need to? So this idea of confidentiality, integrity, and availability.
Mm-hmm.
And every practice we recommend ladders up to one of those three things when it comes to digital security. And I'm sorry, there was one last question.
Yeah. Repeat those three things just so it's engraved in our minds.
Yeah, yeah. So confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So like the idea that, can you keep your information confidential or protected?
Mm-hmm.
Can you trust that it hasn't been tampered with? And can you actually access it when you need to?
Mm-hmm.
And those three things are sort of core to around, keeping our data and systems safe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. The second part of that question was just the top two or three threats that you think groups are facing in this current landscape.
Yeah, so um, I'll say in the current landscape, when I'm sort of thinking about like specifically digital threats to like movements, I think to me the scariest thing is like the legal weaponization of organizational data,
Mm-hmm.
and so some of this bleeds into, of course, and you made this point earlier, was around like crisis communications. Some of it leads into like legal issues, but this idea of like subpoenas and administrative demands or device seizures, um,
Mm-hmm.
to me is one of those things that, it's like we are vulnerable to those areas, and there's some areas where we have the control over what might be available to state sponsored sort of like attacks on an organization.
Mm-hmm.
um Outside of like that, we talked about big tech, the idea of like having your data in big tech, is something that it's just a given, at some point or another, it's going to cross over into, whether it's Google Workspace or whether it's going to cross over that Comcast Xfinity line. So, thinking through, and we have a whole framework around this, but like thinking through what is it that we're trying to protect? Who are we trying to protect it from? What are the
Mm-hmm.
threats that they present to us? And then what are the controls that we have to sort of protect ourselves from those threats? Is something that's also really, when we talk about like defining digital security, but defining it in a way of like, well, how do we deal with it?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the legal weaponization of our information right now to me is like a huge thing. And I think later I can talk
Yeah.
a bit about like how we address some of those.
Yep.
Um, but I also just don't want to say, okay, well, that's the biggest thing that's happening right now, especially around movement-based organizations, are like to me the biggest threat. But let's not forget about just the other normal things like
Mm-hmm.
phishing and account takeovers,
Mm-hmm.
or even coordinated doxing and online harassment.
Mm-hmm.
But really, those are the things that we've been seeing the most of, at least within this last year and a half, which feels like the last 10 years. But yeah.
Yeah. And you, in our work together, definitely we'll come back to some questions around like solutions around these threats, but also in our work together, because we get a lot of phishing attacks. I mean, just random, very concerted phishing attacks. And I know like things like one of my staff people will regularly get texts from people who are saying they're me so they can get access to passwords and things like that. And how you helped me really differentiate that from this is not a coordinated attack from, an opponent of a political candidate I'm working for, or racial justice kind of issue that that was more kind of based on transactional, like just trying to get some financial footing, basically. So talk a little bit about that, like how these attacks are really coming both from people who are just trying to find ways in to get some financial foothold into your organization, or it could be coming from actual like right-wing opponents who are coming against us.
Yeah, I mean, and I think on both ends, like and this is really to your point, these aren't like clumsy spam emails that we used to get like a decade ago. And now, not to also just introduce another topic in here, but like,
Sure.
this idea of AI,
Mhm.
and folks being able to like leverage some of these tools to perform this social engineering, right?
Mhm.
So again, like this, I think you're absolutely correct. There's groups of like organized criminals who want to get paid, and then there's groups of organized criminals who just don't really, and really just don't like the kind of work that you're doing or the folks that you're supporting.
Mhm.
Um, so both of those, in my opinion, have different tactics, if I can say.
Mhm.
Um, I'll say, and this has just been ridiculously rampant. And I'm sure either you or someone on this call has probably already received this. And if you haven't, keep your eye out for it. Where now they're using other platforms that are totally connected and totally vetted. And what I mean by that is using something like DocuSign or Adobe Sign,
Mhm.
where you're just getting a document, or you see a document that just needs to be signed, and it might be a grant agreement, or it might be some like NDA. So it looks totally legitimate. And you would get this email. You would click on the link. It would take you to DocuSign, but within that DocuSign is where the trouble begins. Um, in terms of like identifying whether it's based on like they're just trying to get paid versus whether it's like a right-wing attack. As an example, it really to me depends on the kind of work that you're doing. But in terms of like your programmatic work, but regardless, there has to be some sort of like awareness. I think both in terms of like organizational culture, that
Mhm.
there's a baseline of things that we are doing and that we can do to protect ourselves, regardless of however that attack came,
That's right.
or whatever the purpose of that attack was.
Yeah, yeah, that's really helpful. I definitely want to talk about kind of solutions in a bit, and I see folks already putting questions in the Q&A. Please keep doing that. I'll turn to questions at about 2:45 PT or so. One thing I wanted to just kind of talk with you about is kind of the concrete link between crisis communications, rapid response, right? And digital security, and what you think about how core digital security is rather than this like separate IT strategy. How core has it been to kind of crisis comms and rapid response situations that people have been navigating?
Yeah, and I so appreciate that question because I mean, one, and you've said this a couple times already now, that folks sort of think of like IT or digital security as its own sort of thing. That it really needs to be baked in, not just within operations, but it really needs to be baked in within the culture of the organization. And if anything, this past year has kind of proved that. When we talk about, as an example, like crisis comms, you can't send out a clean crisis message, from a compromised account. Like, if something is happening with your organization, and there's a crisis, that whatever that crisis might be, and you need to like get the message out, about it. uh, the way you're going to get that message out is going to be using these tools and these systems. So when it comes to that, in my mind, I'm like you're assuming that the infrastructure is there and that the digital security is safe. And really an example of that is even like a phishing attack
Mhm.
leads to like an account takeover. An account takeover exposes your donor data, and
Mhm.
that data gets used in some doxing campaign. The campaign forces leadership at this exact moment is where you need to respond publicly. So
Mhm.
my point is like there is a cascade effect around this, and it's hard to kind of separate both functions. So like you need to make sure your stuff is tight so that if something does happen, you are able to effectively communicate back
Mhm.
out.
Mhm. Super
Um,
helpful.
yeah.
Thank you for that. All right. So I want to ask some questions about just how kind of translating risk in plain language. So when you first start working with an organization, can you walk us through kind of the basic risk assessment that you go through, and also just want to say like in non-tech language
Yes.
for those of us who typically
Absolutely.
do that.
Yeah. So and I kind of talked a little bit about this in terms of like our overall framework, but just to like in very pure non-techie language. I mean, whenever we approach an organization, we're basically trying to answer a bunch of different questions. So like
Mm,
we always start with who you are, and who do you serve, right? And then we also want to know like, well, who are the opponents, or who are the bad actors that don't like what you're doing, and what are they capable of? And technology to me is like downstream of that. So when we walk through these four questions, this is like very basic threat modeling. So the first thing again is like what are we actually protecting, like in terms of what are your digital assets, what are the things what are the things that you're holding, and again that could be a bunch of different things based on the organization. It could be donor records, it could be
mhm,
participant intake forms, or some internal strategy, or even just basic like staff personnel information, or your communications platforms. um, and I also like to separate privacy, meaning like people know who you are, but you choose what they get to see, from anonymity, which
mm,
it really is about keeping your activities separate from your identity entirely. But most organizations have never really made that distinction in terms of like the stuff that
mm,
they're holding.
mhm,
um, but again, this and the idea there in plain language is just to say that, what is it that we're actually protecting,
mhm,
and really starting there. Um, and then the next step is really about like the adversaries, like who might come to those assets. Are we talking about like the everyday criminal, or we are you pissing off the government, whatever government that might be,
yeah.
or law enforcement, or do you have other sort of adversaries that you're dealing with?
Mhm,
Um, and then what tactics would they use? I'll say that in general, there are like baseline threats. So things like weak passwords,
mm,
or we talked about phishing and social engineering, or just having a lost, stolen, or a lost or stolen device.
mhm,
Um, but then there's crazier one, or I think like tougher ones like mass surveillance, or subpoenas.
mm,
So
mhm,
if we're worried about those threats, then we can have a conversation about controls. Like what are the things that we have control over to stop these threats?
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
and I think like baseline, there's a lot of, I have a list of things where I'm like, yeah, multi-factor authentication, which just means when I log into something, I'm going to either receive a text message, or I'm going to receive some way that identifies that I am who I
yeah.
am. By the way, the text messaging, it's not our favorite way. I just wanted
Yeah.
to like throw that out there so folks understand. Um, and then there's things like data retention policies, like can we auto delete information that is no longer needed to operate, but is also, and this is where like legal may get involved a little bit, is like, and I'm not telling folks out there to like start purging all your data, And definitely if you've got a subpoena letter, don't do that.
Yeah.
But can we have a data retention policy in place that allows us to legally purge information that we don't need to keep,
Mhm.
and that potentially could put a staff person at risk or a program participant at risk.
Mhm.
Um, but in terms of assessment, this is literally where we start.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also just want to parse out kind of the escalation in terms of threat from like basic threats and protections to all the way up to subpoenas and kind of what you're talking about in terms of the legal weaponization of our data and how we need to kind of protect that from state actors and the difference between the two. I'm also interested in the difference between like organizational digital security protections and then protections for individual leaders, whether it's Black and Brown folks or trans or queer folks or immigrants, and how we protect ourselves as individuals online. If you have any insights on that. So, for example, I know I've gone through like Delete Me to make sure a lot of my data is scrubbed on a regular basis online. Any kind of ID of me online is scrubbed. But can you talk a little bit about that differentiation and how you help groups navigate that as well?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a great point. As an individual leader or an activist, you are out there and you're putting yourself out there. And you're doing it purposefully and in a way that hopefully is like effective. One of the things that we do and sort of offer, well, actually, before I talk about like what we do and what we offer, I'll say that hands down using a service like Delete Me, and there's many services that are out there. I think Delete Me for business, and it's also sort of transformed, but is one of the most effective in my opinion in terms of like removing your information from data brokers. So when we talk about like scrubbing your data off of the internet or off of different places, uh, data brokers exist. It's a very lax sort of controlled tool that exists out there, meaning like people can collect information about you and store it. And even if you get it deleted from there, they can re-add it on a month later.
Mhm.
So a lot of these services like Delete Me, what they do is they go out to these data brokers. They find out information about who you are, and then they go out and look for that information across data broker sites, and then they delete that information. Um, but those data broker sites is where a lot of the doxing happens, meaning like folks will go out and look for your name and find out information from these data broker sites on like, where you live, what's your phone number, who are you married to, what about your kids, a lot of crazy stuff that exists out there. So using a tool like a Delete Me, hands down, is something that we will always recommend doing, and that's like scrubbing the data broker sites. Another one that I'm not sure that folks are aware of, but is the same way that you can search someone's name nowadays, you can search someone's image. So a
Mhm.
picture of you can, so let's say I have a photo of you and I don't know who you are. I can use a tool like PIM Eyes, and that's spelled PIM Eyes, to do image searches, and I can find out your name and then plug your name into somewhere. So if you remember last year, and many of the movement protests, a lot of folks now cover their faces.
Mhm.
And the
Mhm.
primary reason they do that is because when people are going out and taking pictures, and they have a photo of you, now they can link you to that protest and whatever that protest is about. Because I don't like that you're doing that, I can now find out who you are based on your image. So PIMEYES is the I think the largest data broker around that, and sort of like an image search engine. So that's another sort of tool that I recommend people go to. And if you find your image there, you can pay to have it removed, meaning, or you can subscribe to PIMEYES and then work with
Yeah.
them to have that removed.
Yeah.
Um, But the last point I was just going to quickly say is that we my organization also has a process and a system in place where and again, this is like for organizations but also individuals that are at higher risk. Maybe you're in the national news, or maybe you're going to launch a new initiative. We offer ongoing monitoring services, meaning we just track public and dark web spaces, including all the social platforms, forums, and breach repositories. And we're flagging threats, mentions, and emerging risks. And it's really based on keywords and negative sentiment. So the idea there is this, and that's what we currently do with you and your
Yeah.
organization. But this idea that like if someone's out there, making threats or using negative sentiment against your organization, we'll try to find out about it before
Yeah.
it becomes a crisis.
Yeah. I was going to say that's why it's so helpful, because it alerts you to any escalation. So if folks have been part of disinformation attacks, it usually starts in kind of the dark web, and then it will go to kind of the right wing influencer sphere, and then they try to make it break into mainstream and both mainstream social media and media landscape. So it's really helpful to just be aware of it from the start, as a mechanism of protection. I want to ask one more question before there are a couple of questions that I want to get to, but I'm curious, if you could share more about kind of everyday habits that we can, if there were like two or three things we need to make sure to prioritize, whether it's for us personally or for organizations, like everyday small habits or wins, after this webinar, folks can implement to just get better protected digitally.
I love it. Thank you, Bilen. And I know some of the stuff that I've so far talked about is like theoretical, but we've talked about some individual
Sure.
things that folks can do. Um, when I think about just some habits or some basic habits, and specifically three, I would say this to me is more like a very baseline digital security. Like we shouldn't have to think about this. Like these are cheap, fast, and like high impact. And hopefully, if you're not doing these, you should do them this week. But number one is turning on multi-factor authentication everywhere. So like every account that you touch or touches your organization's data or your personal data, if you're just a individual,
Mhm.
has to have multi-factor authentication on. The most secure version of multi-factor authentication is using like a hardware key. The next to me is like authenticator apps. So like whether that's Authy or even Google Authenticator.
Mhm.
And then the least secure of those is the text messages, meaning like the SMS codes that come to your phone. But I would rather have that on than having nothing on, meaning like the text messaging. The other thing I would recommend organizations do, and even individuals, again, is like rolling out a password manager. We personally use 1Password, and for a whole list of reasons I won't talk about now, but I'll just say that like uh, passwords is such a small, silly thing, but it's also one of the biggest areas that we find people all the time messing up on, whether
Mhm.
that's using the same password across different systems, or anyways, the idea of having a password manager addresses a lot of like password reuse. And then organizationally, it also helps with like onboarding and offboarding. And to me, it like ends this sticky note era. So that to me is like another like very low hanging fruit.
Mhm.
Um, but then I would also look into doing, I think the third thing I would say is just doing like a 30-minute, what I call like an access audit. So it doesn't have to be a full-blown security audit of all the things within your organization, but at a minimum, just finding out who still has access to like shared drives, who has
Mhm.
access to Slack, who has access to your social accounts or your financial platforms, and just removing anyone who shouldn't be there.
Mhm. Mhm.
This is especially prevalent when it comes to, we have this culture of like with Google Workspace specifically, and like, hey, I'm going to share this out to these people because we're collaborating with them.
Mhm.
But that happened 3, 4 years ago, and they're still being shared on that platform. So just doing some sort of like access audits around like who has access to your systems and to your data. Those would be my top three things.
Super helpful. All right, I'm going to go to the questions now, kind of starting from the top. First question, in what ways have you seen movements and organizers use tech to make sure in-person, non-tech work is more secure?
I think the probably the most obvious, I would kind of need an example of that, but like, I'm leaning towards something around like encryption, so like having
Mm.
your information encrypted. But I'm not sure what if there's any sort of context around that question would help me.
Okay. So whoever, it's an anonymous attendee. So whoever asked that, if you could give a little bit more context, but I'm also thinking about just even what you shared around folks who are covering their faces when they're going to protests, or ways you can kind of delete your own photo and do searches for your image, things like that, that makes in-person, um, activations or just work a little bit more secure as well.
Absolutely, and I think again, I'm sort of coming at this webinar from, of course, from like a digital security standpoint, but I will say like the idea of anonymity is also very important.
Mm.
So like separating the activities that you do online, whether that's within or whatever that context might be. And one of the areas I always tell folks about is like using a VPN, right?
Yeah,
Like VPNs in general encrypt the communication that you have to wherever you're going. And there's a lot of other benefits to using something like a VPN.
mhm.
Um, but this idea that like, for example, if you are doing some sort of like opposition research, or you're going to a place because you heard about this site that has potentially your image on it. There was a what was it? Canary, I think it was Canary was a site that was like legally doxing people who
Mhm.
stood up around like the folks who were standing up for Gaza.
Mhm.
So if you said anything around that, they would take your image and they would put it on this site.
Mhm.
I wouldn't go to that site just using your own internet
Sure.
and computer. You
Sure.
might want to use a VPN, and the VPN again is going to wherever you're going is going to think you are coming from somewhere else as opposed
Yeah.
to from your home or from
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
office. So
Yeah. And I will just confess to this group and to you. I use VPNs. Sometimes I'm not on X anymore, but when I have to go on X to kind of monitor chatter about an issue or a candidate I'm working on, I will use a VPN to log on to that using a Proton email and like masking my identity. So yeah, not to use it to kind of anonymously harass anyone, but just to kind of protect myself
absolutely,
in that way
absolutely,
is really important.
very
Thank
very
you.
smart.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for answering that, because that was one of the questions that came up too. Um, what would be the top three things to do if your org notices an uptick in right-wing attacks and doxing of staff?
Okay. If they notice an uptick in doxing, so my let me think about this, like in terms of like the top three things I would do. I think immediately, well, I'll take a step back and say that in general, when it comes to this kind of thing, you're gonna wanna have something called in tech language is an IRP, but like an incident response plan, right?
Mm.
Um, but if you were being doxxed, that's kind of the question. Like if
Hmm.
you're being, yeah.
Hmm.
So I think the first thing I would do is like preserve any of the like the actual meaning like documenting and preserving any of the stuff that's actually happening, meaning like so screenshot the doxing content, timestamps, URLs, platforms. um I would definitely do not engage and do not respect, or at least do not respond publicly yet. Of course, this is another area where like crisis communications will come in at some point.
Yeah.
um but I think just making sure that there's evidence, and to me is like essential for like any potential future legal action or like platform takedowns, meaning like asking the platform to like take down that information. um So the first thing again, document and like preserve, and having some kind of like incident log. So like the moment it begins, date, time, incident, and like a description and who was notified and when were they notified. And again, this is like critical both from a crisis communication standpoint, but also from a legal and also platform escalation, and then potentially any other sort of like post-incident review. The number two thing right away would be like lockdown accounts and any personal exposure. So like, of course, things like changing passwords, enabling MFA, and also just tightening your own social media privacy. So like,
Mm.
if you haven't done that, uh, and we talked about this just a second ago, but like if you haven't done the data broker sites, meaning like the delete me, like immediately doing that. And if you're tied to any specific domains, like removing your home address or setting those to private, in terms of like anywhere where your address might be out. And then I think so those are like the two immediate things. And then I think the other thing I really do support is like, of course, your sort of support circle. So, and if you have a tech partner or someone that you're in tech, I would reach out to them. If you have legal, I would reach out to them. And then also one thing that we never talk about or we rarely talk about these things is like the mental health support. So just like having some sort of support around that. Yeah, I think those are the top three things I would say.
Yeah. I love that around, not thinking about these things as just, again, like these very siloed, this is just a tech attack, but also thinking about the in real life support you need mentally, the kind of communication support you might need as well, and approaching things holistically. I love that approach. One more question. The time is moving by so fast. I want to take one more question from this group and then ask one final question to you. From a movement perspective, can you share thoughts on the tensions between needing to document our work to inform future movements, and from an agency perspective, like needing to document our work and just keep some data to inform our future work and the vulnerabilities of current tech? So how do we, the tension between documenting and kind of keeping continuity of our work and our learnings, and the need to move more underground or stealth, for organizations. You talked about kind of like not retaining data, having some sort of data retention policy, not sharing learnings out loud. So the example Jaboa made is around like how repro justice and direct action groups have had to shift, basically.
Yeah, so I'll sort of say this from a digital security standpoint, but I want to encourage, I mean, the person who's asking that to also like work with Bilen and change consulting, because to me, it like at the core of that question still feels like, well, how do we communicate back out about the work that we're doing, and that to me takes a strategy, right? Like, um, but before me like going into there, and I feel like Bill, maybe you're probably better to answer a
Mhm.
part of that. But what I'll say is that like, um, when we're working with organizations, and this is really from like a resilience standpoint, it's like one, we recognize that big tech has their hands dirty, both in terms of like the way they handle our data and the way that, they will open it up to people that shouldn't be seeing that, right? Whether that's maybe government actors or internally or whatever. And that also, like when I say that, I mean that even with these AI bots and being
Mhm.
able to feed it information, um, and just expect that that information is held and retained on their end. So what can we do about that, right? So from my standpoint, I mean, there's to me, there's like three different areas that we can explore. And the first one being something like, and again, I'm sorry for this, but you could write this down, but it's client-side encryption. So the idea that you encrypt your data before it gets to Google is an
Mm,
option, right? So you can encrypt your data and then put it onto Google and then
mm,
share that out. But I'll say that one, it's expensive, and two, it's kind of clunky. It's
Mm,
not us working on a Google Doc together at the same time
yeah.
and being able to see the changes. It removes a lot of that stuff, but it protects your data
Hmm.
while it sits on Google servers. Um, Two is looking into hybrid systems. So, Bilen, if I want to like hang out with you, I might send you a text and say, "Hey, Bilen, let's go have some coffee at some point." But if I'm going to have a sensitive conversation with you, Bilen, I'm going to move that to Signal.
Mm,
We can think of that same hybrid sort of model organizationally, meaning, if we're doing work that is like everyday operational work, then we can keep it hypothetically on a Google server.
mhm,
But
mhm.
if we're dealing with, like, again, program participants and their legal status,
Mm,
or their health status, or other like really sensitive information that could put those people at risk, then maybe we move those to a more privacy focused system,
Yeah,
similar to like Proton. And there's a lot
yeah,
that exists out there.
yeah.
And then the third and final thing, and I'm sorry, I'm going to try to talk a little
No, no,
faster,
no,
is
no,
just
totally
like
fine.
the idea of data retention. So, like, even if your information is encrypted, and even if it sits on Proton, if you do get a subpoena letter, and again, I'm not a legal expert, but hypothetically speaking, you would have to give the keys to the encryption, or you would have to show them the information that you have sitting on a Proton. So having a data retention policy where we're purging information that we no longer necessarily need to operate, um, to me still feels like a safer bet than putting someone at risk.
Yeah.
So ultimately, the guiding star there is like, if you are specifically, if you're putting people at risk, your staff, your program participants, folks within your network, that information should be
Mm,
really prioritized and cared for, and either purged if you don't need it anymore, or encrypted, or put
mm.
onto a different system.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And I
hopefully that
also
kind of.
want to lift up this comment around kind of the tension between convenience versus security as being kind of the big question for us, both personally, to be honest, around big tech and organizationally. Just really quickly, as a follow-up to that, there's a question about how there was a recent article around how an activist deleted private Signal messages were able to be harvested from their phone's notification logs to capture message previews. So if you have any recommendations, how we can make sure we can close any backdoors to these type of even secure messaging services, or if you also have recommendations for like community chat platforms or services for organizing with other people on sensitive topics.
Well, quickly, I'll just say this, and we are sending a message out. I know we sent it to some clients this morning, but if you're on an iOS platform, Apple, iPad, iPhone, like today, please update to the latest operating system. They just released a new update that blocks some of that. And then in terms of like the notification previews, absolutely turn off notification previews. Like, so just for everyone that's there, just to kind of catch you up real quickly, is, you might get a Signal message and you get the notification, and the picture kind of shows like whatever was said. That is being tracked somewhere else within your device. And it's no longer secure. It's something Signal knows about, and something, of course, in this case, Apple knows about. There was an update specifically that I want to say was just released yesterday or today. It's a critical update that blocks the way folks can get to Signal messages. So definitely update
Okay.
and this is just one other thing, which I know I'll just say, is like keeping your devices up to date as much as possible is
Yeah.
always a safer bet, but there's no such thing as like 100% secure,
Yeah.
and data is always there. So,
Yeah.
which is why data retention is also just more important. It's just like, not keeping it is better than always having it.
And also, I will say we'll send out a follow-up email to folks who joined this call or RSVP for this call with some of these tools that we're talking about, so you have them as well. But we're right at the end of our webinar. I know we could probably keep talking about this for a while because there's so much to unpack. We did do this two-part Q&A with Amro on our blog that goes a lot deeper into some of these questions. So Larisha shared them in the chat. please check those out. One final question for you, Amro, because you do talk about kind of this culture of security that is an organizational leadership role, and also kind of what call outs would you have to even funders on how to support us on being more digitally secure?
Yeah, I mean, around the area for culture, I would say, it has to be embedded within the culture. I mean, we see every day the kind of attacks that are happening on our communities, and they're not just happening from some guy's basement anymore. Like, in many levels, these are very intentional state sponsored attacks on our organizations. So like taking this a little bit more serious, I think is like super important. In terms of like actions or like recommendations that I have to funders, absolutely unrestricted multi-year investments in organizations. So it's not just like a one-time audit thing or a purchase, but like really funding organizations around that, and around the safety for their organizations. And there's so many cohorts of funders and folks out there that are actually doing that work. I would just recommend that there's more. And then the last thing I was going to say is also just think about the service providers like Bilen, like Change Consulting, like Shake Technologies, and finding ways to also support us in the work that we're doing to support the organizations that are on the ground.
Thank you so much, Amro, for sharing your thoughts and insights and lessons learned the hard way with us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and sticking with us. I will pass it now to Larisha to close us out.
And quickly, Amro, if you could just let people know a little bit of how they can reach you all and find out more about your services.
Yeah, absolutely. So of course you can always reach us at my website, shaketech.com. We're actually going to revamp that, and a new version of it is coming out next week. But regardless, we have a contact page there. You can always feel free to email me, amro@shaketech.com. And if there's any follow-up questions or things that folks wanna check in about, by all means, please send me an email.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the insight that you shared. We greatly, greatly appreciate it. The website link to Shake Tech is in the chat. We can drop that in there once again as well. And if you're interested in learning more about Change Consulting, please go ahead and head over to our website, and make sure you hit that contact us link and form and fill that out. And we would love to have a conversation with you as well. We are definitely excited that you were able to join us today, and we appreciate your time. Make sure you follow us on all social platforms. And again, we look forward to seeing more from you. And we hope that you stay tuned, because we'll have many, many more webinars coming your way. And no worries, if you've previously missed any webinar that we've already had, just head over to our YouTube channel and you can check out those there as well. Stay on the lookout for our May topic. We will be releasing that very, very soon. Again, thank you for your time this evening. We hope that you all have a great remainder of your day. Bye-bye.